Chapter 3 Visitors. On the trampled grass in the moonlight, the chief lay beside his son, Jerab. The women gathered around and looked at Jerab's terrible injured leg. They began to wail and to grieve. They all knew that Jerab was the only living child of his old parents, the youngest of 7 children. The others had all died in babyhood. Now the chief's only son was gravely injured, and by his own father, in a drunken fight. Kunin and Paku looked at each other. They had been drinking too, but not so much as the others. They realized that a dreadful thing had happened. "Now, what shall we do?" Paku asked the witch doctor. Kunin twisted his hands together in a frenzy of worry and fright. "He can never walk again," the old witchman whispered. "It is the anger of the spirits. He can never be chief. Who ever saw a chief with his legs sticking out like that?" The young man moved in his drunken stupor. His breath came in dry snores, and he moaned with every movement of his chest. With Saski's help, they moved him to his father's house, which was only a short distance away and near the hut of Paku. There they laid him on the mat. Saski was left alone with Jerab for a moment while the other 2 men went to drag in the old chief. The boy stood looking down at Jerab. A strange thought crossed his mind. What about the god of Rajan? Could he help someone with a trouble like this? No one in the village of Broken Light knew what to do. God. The thought of God frightened him. Where had it come from? He felt sickness rising again in his stomach. It must be almost morning. The eastern mountain has shown a faint glow. When Paku and Kunin had dragged the chief to his mat in the same room, they came to stare at Jerab. Then Kunin hurried out the door. He had gone to fetch his charms, of course. "Father!" Saski took hold of Paku's hand. It was cold and shaking. "Father!" Then the words came, forced from his unwilling throat. "The teacher Rajan at Singing Water. He might know what to do." Paku looked at Saski. Then he turned to see if Kunin might be lingering at the door. The trembling man fixed his clouded eyes on the lad. "You have been home only 3 days, and already you want to send for the god teacher." There was anger in his face. I don't want to, Saski insisted. "But I feel so sorry for Jerab. It's hurting him so much. How can his leg get better if it is not pulled back straight again?" Paku did not answer. In a minute, Kunin came into the room. In one hand he carried a dried crocodile, in the other a bag of charms. His face was dark with fury. "What's this you say?" He turned on Saski, screaming his anger. "That leg will stay exactly as it is unless it goes back by itself. We will not have the teacher coming to this village and spoiling all of our pleasures as he has done in Singing Water." The chief's wife had called all of her relatives. A crowd was beginning to gather. Saski felt faint and ill. He slipped out the door and ran to his father's hut and threw himself on his sleeping mat. When he awakened, it was broad daylight. The sun was halfway to the zenith, and he heard voices outside, voices that he recognized. He leaped from his mat and hurried out. Uncle Sobat and Rajan stood there in the hot sunshine. His father was talking with them. Saski was too amazed to speak. He tried to remember what he had done earlier that morning. What had he done? His heart pounded with excitement. His hair prickled. He had Oh, yes, he had suggested that Rajan be called to help Jerab. Yet no one had called him. No one at all. "Who called you?" Pacu was asking in a severe voice. "No one called us," Uncle Sobat answered. "All last night I couldn't sleep." He laid his hand on his brother's shoulder. "I felt concerned about Sasky. He got a rather late start, and his load was very heavy. I wondered if he got home all right. I thought maybe one of you might be sick. I asked Rajan to come up with me this morning." Pacu was still sullen. "You can see for yourself that we are both well." Then a sound came from the chief's house. It was a groan of agony. The two men started and looked towards the window of the house. "Who's that?" Rajan asked with an expression of alarm and sympathy in his face. Pacu said nothing, and Sasky dug his toes into the grassy sod and looked at them. "Is someone sick in the chief's house?" Uncle Sobat gave his brother a little shake. "Tell me, is the chief down with the fever again?" "No, it is Jerab, the chief's son." Sasky found his voice at last. He looked straight into the eyes of the teacher. "He had a fight with his father early this morning before daylight, and his leg is hurt." "But that's impossible," Uncle Sobat explained. "The chief almost worships his son. He wouldn't hurt him for anything. Come, tell us the truth." "They had been drinking quite a lot," Pacu began to explain. "The chief is still drunk. He does not know yet that his son is hurt." "Come, let us go and see what's wrong." Uncle Sobat led the way to the chief's house, and Rajan followed him. Pacu and Sasky lagged behind a little. They had just seen Kunin come out of his own door, and he was hurrying towards them with a look of astonishment and anger on his face. The teacher and Uncle Sobat had not noticed him. They were already calling in front of the chief's door. The chief's wife hurried to let them in. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Kunin came down on Pacu and Sasky like an angry bee. "What are they here for?" he screamed. "Who called them?" He waved his arms and spat in his rage. "How dare they bring their magic to this village?" "Wait," Pacu took hold of the witch doctor's arm. "You are too quickly angry. No one called them. They just happened to come. They wanted to find out if Sasky got home all right. They didn't know about the chief's son until now. They heard him moaning." The small man jerked away from Pacu's grasp and ran into the chief's house. The other two followed him. Sasky wondered what Rajan would do now. His mind was a whirl of wild thoughts. Had he really called the teacher? Early this morning, when his heart had turned to the God of heaven and he spoke his name, had God been listening? Was that the reason Uncle Sobat couldn't sleep? Was God letting him know that there was trouble in the village of Broken Light? He felt as guilty as though he himself had made the long journey to Singing Water and called the teacher with his own voice. Uncle Sobat and the teacher were kneeling by the mat where Jerab lay wreathing and moaning. "This is a dislocation of the hip," Rajan said. "How many hours has it been since he was hurt?" He looked at Pacu. Kunin screamed in fury. "You may go now," he said, looking at Rajan with hatred in his eyes. His long yellow teeth clicked together. "Go! Go! We don't need your medicine in this village." The noise of shouting roused the chief. He stirred in his sleep. He stopped snoring. He sat up on his mat and rubbed his eyes with his big hands. Then he saw his son. He saw the legs sticking out at his side. He heard the young man's groans. A look of terror crossed his face. What? he muttered with a thick tongue. "What's the matter?" He staggered to his feet. "How did he get hurt?" "The two of you had a fight early this morning, and you threw him to the ground," Paco said without mercy. At this, Koonin began a dance about the floor in a frenzy of anger, swinging the small dried crocodile and screaming, "Go! Go!" He shook his clenched fists at Rajan's face. Rajan still knelt by the injured man. He raised his eyes and looked at the witch doctor. "If the chief wants me to go, let him command me," he said. "It is his son who is hurt. If his leg is not straightened at once, it will be impossible to do it. Even now it will be very difficult." The chief looked at Rajan with anguished eyes. "It is I who have done this terrible thing. It was the wicked spirits in the rice wine, the wicked spirits." He moaned to himself. "Can you help us? Can you help us?" Then Rajan asked Pacu again, "How long has it been since he was hurt?" "It was early this morning, before daylight, 4 or 5 hours ago," Rajan said, biting his lower lip. "No time to lose. It is swollen already. You will have to help me." Koonin stood watching for a moment. Now he ran outside the house, uttering wild shouts and imprecations. Rajan looked around at Pacu and Uncle Sobat. "You must help me. It will take 3 or 4 strong men to do this." The chief's son was conscious now. He looked from one face to another with terror in his eyes. The pain of the dislocated joint was so great that he cried out with every breath. Beads of sweat stood out over his chest, his neck, and his face. Rajan took his hand. "My friend, you have been badly hurt. Now we are going to try to help you. It will cause much pain, but it must be done. You want your leg to get well, don't you?" Jarab nodded his head. The teacher spoke again. "Be strong and brave, and don't fight against us, even when we hurt you. Make yourself as limp and loose as you can. That will make it easier." Then Rajan showed Uncle Sobat and Pacu how to take hold of Jarab under his arms, pulling his shoulders away while the teacher pulled with all of his strength on the crooked leg to straighten it. The chief stood over his son, calling out words of encouragement. Both Pacu and Sobat were strong men, used to carrying heavy loads on steep trails for long hours, yet they braced themselves and pulled with all their strength, and at last the chief had to help them. It took the combined effort of them all. Sasky caught hold of Jarab's good leg and held it tightly. The young man tried to be brave and patient, but cry after cry of agony filled the house, and before the leg was pulled back into place, he became unconscious again. He lay limp and pale on his mat. "Now we must split it so it can't be moved or bent," the teacher said. "Bring me green bamboo." The village people who had crowded into the room craned their necks to see what the teacher was doing. They were all eager to help. Some of them ran for the bamboo. The teacher sent others for soft, old rags and strips of cloth. Rajan cut several strips of the green bamboo and smoothed them carefully with his knife. He bound them into a shell for the leg. It fitted tightly all around and extended from the hip to the foot. It was padded wherever it touched the flesh. It took a long time. Koonin had not come back. Gradually, the young man's face took on more color and his breathing came more quietly. The 2 visitors from Singing Water prepared to leave. No one had welcomed them to Broken Light. No one had spoken kindly to them. Only the chief had said in his deep trouble, "Can you help us?" For that they had stayed. They had put Jerub's leg back in place. They had not prayed or sung songs or said the name of God. They did not need to. Saskia could hear it ringing in his mind. God was there in the chief's room where Jerub lay. God was in the path, in the house. This teacher brought God wherever he went, and he left God behind him too. Keep him very quiet for a day or two, then prop him up as much as you can with the splint on, but he must not try to walk for a moon and a half, maybe 2 moons. See that you do as I tell you, otherwise he will have much pain and trouble. Do you understand me? Rajan spoke to the chief, who sat sobbing beside his son. I will do as you say, he whispered in a broken voice. Feed him well, wash the rest of his body every day, the teacher said, and the 2 men started down the path leading out of the village of Broken Light. Saskia stood in the door of his father's hut and watched them go. He was glad when they disappeared in the lower jungle. He felt uncomfortable and sad about the whole affair. He wanted time to think and to try to understand. Did God really know about the chief's son being hurt? Was God there through the night while they were dancing and drinking? Did God see the fight? Was he sorry for the hurt man? Did he hear the desire of his own heart for the teacher to come? Had he really sent those 2 up the mountain just in time? Who is God, anyhow? Couldn't a person get away from him? Was God going to come after him all the time now? Couldn't he even think without God knowing and answering? He felt so troubled that he went to bathe at the spring. He scrubbed himself vigorously and let the cool water run over his naked body for a long time. On his way back from the spring, Saskia looked in at the chief's house to see how Jerub was doing. The old chief was feeding him rice gruel from the coconut shell. Does it still hurt? Saskia asked as he knelt down to examine the neat splint Rajan had placed on his leg. Of course it hurts a lot, Jerub answered in a weak voice, but nothing like it did before the strange young man pulled it into place. Who is he, anyhow? Then Saskia answered in a slow, unwilling voice. He is the God teacher from Singing Water.